The year is 1990. It's your birthday, and your parents let you pick out any video game you wanted for your NES console back at home. All the buzz in the schoolyard is about Super Mario Bros. 3. You did not want to miss out. You read the back of the box for one last confirmation, but you know it's the game that you need. As you take a seat in your family's Ford Explorer, you tear off the plastic seal and open it up. You're greeted with an overwhelming amount of material to read on your way back home. The manual keys you in on the story. After all, it is crucial to know why you're beating up Bowser. You glance at the 7 colorful Koopas, read all about the new and returning enemies, and familiarize yourself with the controls. Though it's not like the manual provides much in-depth detail on the secrets of the game. You have to somehow convince your parents to let you get the brand new guidebook. But that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Luckily, included in the box is a special insert encouraging you to mail it in for a free guidebook with the purchase of a year's subscription to Nintendo's premium game magazine, Nintendo Power. But that's not all. You pull out a massive poster, complete with all of Nintendo's best-selling games. Now you're playing with Power, written boldly under the company's logo. It's only natural that you hang this up in your room as soon as you get home. This moment from 32 years ago likely happened to at least a few of you listening. But maybe you had a similar moment from the late 90s with Pokemon Red, pulling out the manual, reading the player's guide offer, getting excited about Pokemon Stadium for the N64's imminent release. Maybe it happened in the 2000s with Grand Theft Auto 4, where you attempted to memorize the map of Liberty City before you got home, reading through them while you waited for your sibling to hand over the controller for your turn on the system, mailing in a registration card to get a free $5 off your next purchase of a Konami game, or sending in a contest form to get the chance at winning a new t-shirt. Well, for better or for worse, these experiences seldom happen nowadays. Far gone is the era of paper manuals and free posters, instead replaced with, well, nothing. The relationship that these free flyers packed into video game boxes fostered between consumer and corporation is one that is rare and fleeting. But that's not to say that it's dissipated completely. I happen to collect games. Part of that hobby, at least for me, includes accidentally amassing massive amounts of paperwork, from manuals to promotional offers to registration cards. There's nothing stopping me from mailing one of those long-expired inserts to Nintendo, is there? There are lots of videos out there of people sending in mail to Nintendo and getting responses, and little trinkets as well, all throughout YouTube. So that isn't a particularly novel concept, but the idea of sending in a 1987 dated insert that technically hasn't expired is, in fact, kind of novel. I don't think anybody has ever done that before. And that brings us to the 2 inserts that I decided to choose. This one's upside down. The 2 inserts that I decided to choose. And the main reason I decided on both of these is because they don't have an expiration date. So Nintendo Fun Club, for a little bit of background, was the predecessor to Nintendo Power. It started in 1987, and this was included with some of their earliest games ever that they released in the US. On the other hand, Konami was one of the earliest third-party publishers on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1986. This was a 1987 dated insert, but it also does not have any expiration date. So while I might not actually have legal standing for sending in my $7.50 and getting something physical in return, they technically do owe me something, because there is nowhere on here, not even in the fine print, that says that the offer expires at a certain point. The actual experience of writing on these documents is very intentional. Entire set for $7.50. That seems like a pretty solid deal back in 1988. And it absolutely has a psychological impact on how a person thinks about the company that they're interacting with, and to a certain extent, how that company is interacting with the customer themselves. This is something that doesn't really occur anymore. You know, we can email companies or post on message boards or respond to them on Twitter and maybe sometimes get a response.
Age. Should I lie about my age? No.
But it's not as intentional as it used to be. And as I write on these documents from 1987 that have never previously been written on before, that's something that I'm definitely paying attention to. For better or for worse, that sort of thing doesn't exist anymore. And it's very interesting as a 23-year-old to kind of be going back into the shoes of somebody who may have been doing this in the late 80s.
Putting this into here.
And experience, what they may have been experiencing.
So they have my DNA.
So, yeah, as I physically write on these, as I physically go to a mailbox and put them in, that is something that I will certainly be thinking about. And that's something that was the norm back when these were produced, but it's changed quite a bit since then. The Magnavox Odyssey, released in 1972, was arguably the first home console. It also had a distinct lack of boxes, since it came with several pre-installed games. Our journey really begins with the Fairchild Channel F, which was the first system to use cartridges sold separately. Games would typically come packaged with a manual, a small advertisement for upcoming titles, and a warranty card for players who ended up with a defective cart. Including a pamphlet encouraging customers to check out future products is hardly something that started with video games. Television sets, home appliances, cars, and more came with catalogs meant to drill the name of a brand into the buyer's head. After all, it's an unavoidable place to show off products. When someone opens the box, they're going to see it. However, whether it was cost-cutting or simple overconfidence that their product would sell itself, this approach never became standard during this period of the home console market. The majority of Atari 2600, Intellivision, and ColecoVision games came only with a manual. Some kept a warranty card, but many more chose to print the warranty details on the side of the box. After all, the more hidden the warranty was, the less likely customers would actually return the item in the first place. And so this trend continued up until the mid-80s, when a new company managed to secure more than 65% of the home console market share. Yeah, Nintendo. 1983 brought a particularly bad downturn in console sales in the US, appropriately coined the video game crash of 1983. Oversaturation, poor quality control, and waning consumer trust left the industry in shambles. Nintendo did a fantastic job of combating each of these factors, as discussed in my video on Nintendo's black boxes, reviving the US market in large part thanks to their genius marketing. They relied heavily on two things: engagement with their audience and grassroots outreach, the kind of direct, personal approach that was carefully designed to rebuild consumer trust one interaction at a time. The strategies around the NES's launch encapsulated these ideals, from the test market rollouts in New York toy stores where Nintendo reps personally walked kids through Duck Hunt, to the no-risk consignment deals offered to hesitant retailers. However, no idea captures this better than the ingenious Nintendo Game Plan poster. Every single game that was part of the initial black box set came with one. It included a complete checklist of games they had released, as well as all of the ones that they were planning to put out in the coming months. This encouraged a collecting mindset among their audience. Even though there was no tangible reward for buying every black box game, it tapped into a primal human instinct to gather and check things off of a list. Even more genius was their framing of this advertisement as a poster, no pun intended. Countless Nintendo fans inevitably hung it in their rooms, functionally acting as free advertising. This was a technique quickly poached by nearly every third-party developer on the system. Nintendo had shown how effective it could be, and competitors saw it as a clear advantage worth expanding on. These kinds of extras created a direct line between company and player, turning what could have been a one-off purchase into the start of an ongoing relationship. From Bandai to Capcom to Acclaim, it soon became standard to include some kind of poster insert with their games, but some publishers took it even further. Konami, for example, offered a much larger, higher quality poster of one of their games for just the cost of shipping, a step above the free inserts that had become commonplace. Tecmo pushed this idea further still, offering a free watch to anyone who bought 5 of their titles and mailed in cut-out stamps from each manual. These kinds of offers convinced players to spend serious cash, $35 or almost $100 today accounting for inflation, on each game in exchange for what was essentially a cheap trinket. And yet, that tangible prize, earned through a kind of paid scavenger hunt, helped build a sense of recognition and reciprocity. The act of buying games itself became subtly gamified, turning consumption into an extension of play. It's a level of competitive marketing that feels shocking now precisely because the pressure that drove it doesn't really exist anymore. But at the time, companies had to fight to stand out, and strategies like these made publishers feel like a real part of their players' lives. Pretty soon, nearly everyone was adding promotional inserts into their games, posters, coupons, and so on. Registration cards were yet another extension of this idea. Players could mail one in, get a few bucks off their next game, or be entered into a sweepstakes by filling out a small form, and in return, companies would build relationships and gain valuable consumer insights. But in 1987, this idea expanded. The art of the free newsletter, signed up for via registration card, became yet another one of Nintendo's strategies that fed into their emphasis on consumer relationships and guerrilla marketing. Nintendo Fun Club was a free newsletter mostly made up of fan and company interactions. To get signed up, all you had to do was fill out a short form and mail it in, providing Nintendo's marketing team with useful data and, more importantly, building a sense of personal connection with players, for the cost of staffing a small newsletter team. More importantly, the Fun Club, in combination with the various other generous free offerings Nintendo had, from the poster insert to their warranty service, reflected how they wanted to be seen. They did a perfect job personifying themselves as a company that actually cared, that wasn't just in it for the money. They achieved the brand trifecta: humanization, cultural ubiquity, and becoming eponymous. By 1987, Nintendo knew that even more third-party companies would be publishing for their system, and they intended to sow brand loyalty into the depths of their customers' brains. The idea also spread, with several other companies, including Sunsoft and Broderbund, launching their own free newsletters. This strategy was a win-win for consumers and companies alike. For just a few cents per game sold, companies got free marketing, free advertising, and, most importantly, a shot at a direct interaction with a single customer. Brand loyalty is built fast when there's a tangible touchpoint between consumer and producer. If you're physically mailing something into Bandai's headquarters, you sure as hell aren't going to forget their name the next time you're looking for a video game to purchase. This was a strategic move, but it was also a necessary one. Everyone else was doing it, and that meant companies who didn't include inserts or outreach efforts looked cheap or disconnected by comparison. Consumers started to expect some kind of bonus with their purchase, and when it wasn't there, it was noticeable. In an era where dozens of publishers were competing for shelf space and player attention, being the one company that offered nothing extra made you look lazy or out of touch. However, even companies that didn't want to give away free items could still tap into this trend through more integrated approaches. Inserts existed on the marketing side, but there was another important type that probably saved many of you from throwing your NES out of the window when getting lost in The Legend of Zelda's massive overworld. Maps and gameplay tips often came packaged with more complex games, especially ones with sprawling worlds or gameplay mechanics that weren't immediately obvious. They didn't rely on that relationship to exist, but they did still grow out of it. Take Section Z, for instance. Players complained that the manual was too vague, that the game was too difficult, and that there was no way to beat it with the information available. They wrote and called into Konami, asking for help to such an extent that Konami decided to include a map in all future editions of the game after October of 1987, even providing a free one to anyone who mailed in a request. The relationship was two-sided, and that was crucial. Players' buying habits were influenced by companies, but companies were also listening and making meaningful changes based on their audience's needs. This eventually led to the inclusion of maps and gameplay tips even when guides were being included in Nintendo Power magazines. To name a couple, Dragon Quest, which included character learn sets and enemy weaknesses to help Western players unfamiliar with its mechanics, and Metal Gear, an extraordinarily complex action-adventure game that benefited from a lot of extra guidance. In addition to being functional, they also served a more subtle purpose. Having a map provided a bridge between utility and brand building. It was a physical gesture of support. It showed that the company anticipated your struggle and was going to help. In that sense, these inserts operated as trust-building tools. They reinforced the idea that the publisher was on your side, not just selling you a product, but guiding you through it. They had positioned themselves as allies in the player's experience, and in doing so, secured a deeper kind of brand loyalty. By the late 80s, Nintendo had built something remarkable. They completely redefined the home console market after the crash through a mix of consistently high-quality games and unique marketing. They established an extremely loyal base of players and pushed their competitors to do the same. Even as that foundation solidified, the environment around them was beginning to shift. The Sega Genesis became the first serious challenge to Nintendo's hold on the home console market with their new SNES, though both companies were providing similar amounts of mail-in inserts to connect with their audiences. The more telling shift came from Nintendo itself, the transition from the free Nintendo Fun Club to the paid Nintendo Power. Nintendo claimed this change was driven by demand. The sheer volume of fans signing up for the newsletter had made it unsustainable as a free offering. But that explanation only tells part of the story. The move to a paid subscription was reorienting their relationship with fans. Nintendo was no longer in the business of giving things away to build an audience. They already had one, and now that audience had room for further monetization. Nintendo Power still offered engagement, tips, community, and branding, but it did so behind a price tag. This was one of the first real signs that Nintendo was ready to convert its loyalty pipeline into a revenue stream. Meanwhile, on the third-party front, the trend of including inserts in games continued, no matter which console was published on. Registration cards remained popular with just about every company, Square, Natsume, and Atlus to name a few. Physical representations of in-game elements stayed common as well, with maps included for titles like Chrono Trigger and enemy charts appearing in complex JRPGs like Ogre Battle. But things like free poster offers or free newsletters were becoming a thing of the past. Each of these companies had, like Nintendo, built up a solid fan base. With this dominance came a decreased need to simply give away extras. They didn't have to do it anymore. But it wasn't just the free newsletters that had disappeared. Another kind of insert started to fade around this time, spurred in part by the new console generation. In the early days, specifically with Atari and NES, game guides usually bundled coverage of several titles into one book or magazine issue, since most games weren't particularly complex. However, as games became more complicated and companies had developed a more dedicated fan base, game-specific guidebooks became the new standard. These individually sold books were practically required reading if you wanted to understand how to play games that weren't intuitive, especially for someone unfamiliar with the genre. Companies still included basic charts or tip sheets, but they were clearly nudging players towards buying the full official guides. This trend picked up with the Super Nintendo era, with Nintendo once again leading the herd. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past came with a map, but also an insert pushing players to subscribe to Nintendo Power for $15, which included the full guidebook. Other companies quickly adopted the model. Square used it for Final Fantasy III, bundling in a map alongside a registration card that prompted players to mail it in, plus $18, for the complete guide. Even some late NES games, like Dragon Warrior 3, followed this same approach. Receiving a hint sheet as a teaser for a full guidebook made it feel like the publisher was still offering something helpful, even as they shifted towards paid content. But the move away from free goodies was becoming the standard. The industry had matured. Most major players had carved out their space, and with that stability came a certain complacency. Nintendo was still including advert posters throughout the Super Nintendo era, but they had lost the collect them all intention and high quality printing of the black box era. Instead, they were often filled with screenshots and text coming off as more obligatory advertisements than engaging extras that a kid would want to hang in his room. A couple dozen companies had come out on top, and the pecking order was taking on a more permanent shape. With that, the drive for creative, consumer-focused marketing slowed, and it wasn't going to change until someone gave them a reason to shake things up again. By 1994, Nintendo had more or less defeated Sega in the console war, but a new competitor had entered the fray, Sony. The PlayStation ditched cartridge-based games altogether and committed fully to CD-ROMs. With these smaller, more affordable discs came a host of new opportunities. Of course, registration cards, posters, and maps were still around when applicable, but this was just the beginning. One major innovation was the demo disc, multi-game samplers that gave players a quick taste of upcoming or recently released titles. These were obtainable from all sorts of outlets: fast food chains like Pizza Hut and McDonald's, the PlayStation Underground magazine, and retailers. They were inexpensive to mass produce, making them a far more cost-effective way to offer an interactive preview at scale than the cartridge demos exclusive to retail displays of past generations. Later in the PlayStation's lifecycle, another step forward arrived, bundling a bonus demo disc inside a full-priced game. Dino Crisis, released in September of 1999, is a particularly important example. The logic was simple. Dino Crisis is a survival horror game. If you're playing that, you're probably going to want Resident Evil 3. The demo disc let publishers pre-select an audience and speak directly to them. The demo disc insert quickly became popular in cases where publishers didn't want to partner with a retailer, or, more importantly, felt that their game deserved the spotlight. They were self-sponsored standalone showcases that players could not avoid. It was another way to get them excited and connected to the company, albeit in a slightly more detached way than physically mailing something to their address. Meanwhile, Nintendo was stuck with the limitation of cartridges. Interactive demos weren't practical, so instead they leaned on promotional VHS tapes distributed through Nintendo Power rather than packed into games. Inserts during this era were stagnant. Free posters had completely disappeared from first-party titles, as Nintendo, confident in its base, no longer saw any need to offer those small gestures of added value. The only real novelty, though not tied directly to inserts, was the emergence of collector's editions, Ocarina of Time being Nintendo's first. PC games had already invented the idea, but on consoles this hinted at a shift. Extras were no longer free gestures. They were bonuses for paying a bit more, or pre-ordering the game in this case. This left only Nintendo Power subscription offers, along with the occasional registration card or poster from less established third-party publishers, who still felt the need to prove their worth to players. Nothing was pushing the medium forward, and with Sony's CD format already reshaping the industry, Nintendo's reluctance to abandon cartridges effectively sidelined them from this new wave of experimentation. By the time the GameCube arrived, Nintendo had finally switched to discs, and with that came their own attempt at the demo model. Mario Kart Double Dash included a disc with downloadable content for Fire Emblem, though it was limited to the game's pre-order edition, and the pairing itself was a little odd. I don't think there was much overlap between Mario Kart players and Fire Emblem fans. So yes, Nintendo was giving away free stuff again, but this time it felt different. This couldn't be framed as the voluntary generosity they had portrayed themselves as having in the past. The identity that they'd carefully built up over decades was starting to crack under the pressure of real competition. They were now trying to keep up. So it's been about 3 months since I sent those inserts out. And a lot of things have changed. My hair's longer. I got a full-time job, hence why I look so tired. The Switch 2 is coming out soon as well. But I don't really feel that great. My limited knowledge of the American mail system tells me that the packages did in fact arrive, and they have likely been opened at this point. But I've still not heard back anything. Looking back on my younger self, I kind of wonder if maybe I was just too starry-eyed, too naive. And I don't really think that this grand plan is actually going to come together in the way that I was expecting. Let's get back to where we were. Entering the 6th generation of consoles, the market was changing rapidly. The game changed from who can dominate the entire video game market to who can dominate their own fan base. Their goal became converting non-gamers into gamers. And what I'm specifically talking about here is families and old people. This inspired every aspect of their future marketing, including the inserts that they were including or not including in their games moving forward. Come November of 2001, Microsoft entered the fray with a totally different approach that would reshape the way people thought about inserts. Their biggest first-party titles, Halo and Halo 2, included pretty much nothing. No registration card, no poster. Aside from a small insert advertising other Microsoft games or promotions like a 7-Eleven Halo Slurpee Cup sweepstakes, the packaging was bare. And unlike the old mail-in models, that sweepstakes was entirely digital. You didn't physically send anything back, you logged on. This makes sense. Microsoft didn't have to try. The years of brand recognition that they had already built up worked to their great advantage, ensuring that teens and adults the world over would already know and trust who was making the system. The only work they really had to do was around the brand of Xbox itself, but Halo was already set to dominate the platform. There was little incentive to invest in additional extras that would only marginally improve fan connection. Loyalty didn't have to be built through posters or mail-ins anymore. It was built through exclusivity. People bought an Xbox because they wanted Halo. The extras themselves hadn't disappeared though. They'd been moved. What once came standard was now locked behind collector's editions. Halo 2 is the perfect example. For $5 more, you could buy a special edition with bonus content, like a behind-the-scenes DVD and a Conversations from the Universe insert, adding all sorts of lore to the game. By today's standards, this feels like a great deal, but it marked a real philosophical shift. 10 years earlier, games like Killer Instinct on the Super Nintendo included a soundtrack CD by default. What had once been a small gesture of added value was now a tiered product. Collector's editions reframed inserts as luxury items. It was emblematic of a broader shift. The relationship between company and player was moving online. Taking a look at Halo's other main insert, we can see the clearest sign of where things were headed. Instead of a registration card, Microsoft published Xbox games were coming with a free trial code for Xbox Live. Players were pushed online, where the interaction could be tracked, monetized, and extended. It was a fundamentally different relationship. Mailing in a card was a two-way street. Recognition and visibility for the customer, and demographics insight for the company. Entering a code online was about onboarding. Microsoft wasn't giving you a reason to remember their name and address. They were giving you a reason to log in, create an account, and start paying for a service. Of course, this was by and large the cost-effective way to control and analyze the flood of information that would now flow through these channels. The bigger the video game world got, the more people were buying, the harder it would be to maintain a crew of employees to read letters and physically write data down. But while the quantity of interactions had increased, the noticeable difference was in the quality. The loyalty and goodwill that once came from a physical, deliberate gesture was gone, and so was the autonomy players had in choosing to build that connection. Microsoft now owned every step of the exchange, from the first login screen to the recurring subscription. What had once been a relationship built on shared gestures now became one dictated almost entirely by the company, and that was the real innovation with this new model. Around this same time, Sony was phasing out demo discs and registration cards for their first-party titles, shifting them almost entirely into PlayStation the Official Magazine, their sponsored answer to Nintendo Power. It kept the illusion of free extras alive, but only as bait for subscriptions. Microsoft had already shown that you could ship massive titles without any of the usual fluff, and their success forced the rest of the industry to reevaluate whether inserts were worth the cost. By the early 2000s, third-party publishers were the only ones still holding on to the tradition, occasionally slipping in posters, registration cards, or coupons as ways to keep fans mailing things back and reinforcing loyalty. But even this was changing. EA Sports is a perfect example. Their PlayStation 1 and Genesis games came with registration cards, posters, the whole 9 yards. Pun very much intended. By 2002, just a couple of years into the PS2 era, these packages had been reduced to a manual and a registration card you could either mail in or complete online. By 2003, the physical option was gone altogether, replaced by online-only registration. And EA wasn't alone. This was the general trend across the whole industry. Inserts were no longer a necessary way to compete or differentiate, so why include them? Nintendo kept pace with the rest of their competitors, continuing to let go of the very practices that had once set them apart. While they did still include bundle offers for Nintendo Power, most often tied to guidebooks, there wasn't much else left. In 2002, they launched a new registration program called My Nintendo, well in line with the online-only model the entire industry was shifting toward. My Nintendo, not to be confused with the current rewards program of the same name, which is probably an attempt to cover up the original, provided players with an online portal to check on repairs, purchase Nintendo games, and register products. But unlike earlier programs, it rarely, if ever, led to tangible rewards. Much like Sony and Microsoft, Nintendo was moving its fan interaction online and away from pack-in extras. On these inserts was one bullet point dedicated to alerting customers to the existence of a brand new venture, the Insider Forums. What had once been a back-and-forth relationship in the reader-sourced Nintendo Fun Club was now replaced by these forums, which allowed for fan interaction and creation, but in a way that was much more physically disconnected than the Fun Club's letters and printed responses. The internet was becoming more accessible, but in the early 2000s it was still out of the way for most people, and the difference in reach shows. Nintendo Fun Club had 750,000 members at the time of its closure, while Insider likely topped out somewhere around 100,000, give or take. This is an estimate extrapolated from archived screenshots. This isn't to say that the forum wasn't significant. Insider was hugely formative for a generation of Nintendo fans and early internet users, but the kind of interaction it created was very different. The forums were set up by Nintendo and moderated by employees, yet the real day-to-day culture and energy came from fans themselves. That distinction matters. Inserts were about a company directly handing something to the player. They were physical, deliberate gestures of acknowledgement. Forums, by contrast, pushed responsibility for interaction onto the players. The company provided the infrastructure, but no longer carried the same burden of cultivating loyalty. If anything, the power struggles that occurred between mods and users, including arguments about unfairly deleted threads and strict rules that seemed to be nonsensical and, dare I say, totalitarian, damaged loyal fans' views of Nintendo.
It was almost its own separate community, and then they closed it. I'm not sure why. They made up some kind of excuse.
The relationship became less about a company speaking to its fans and more about fans speaking to each other under the company's watchful eye. The reciprocity of inserts was instead replaced by a corporate-managed community space. We can see this disappointment reflected in responses Nintendo was receiving at the time. Coming from a company that used to shower customers with posters and maps, fans weren't thrilled about the stripped-back, online-only approach, especially when Europe and Japan both got full-fledged rewards programs. Complaints poured in through calls, letters, and posts on the Insider forums themselves. And it worked. By 2008, Nintendo began allowing registered products to count towards Club Nintendo, which did offer physical items as loyalty rewards.
Game & Watch collection for Nintendo DS, Wii Remote holders, and Hanafuda cards.
These inserts replaced My Nintendo ones for the next several years. What's especially telling here is that the shift wasn't driven by revenue concerns. Nintendo was experiencing their single most profitable year ever following the release of the Wii. Instead, due in part to the sheer volume and persistence of fan feedback, they were pushed to acknowledge the dissatisfaction of their core audience. This stands as one of the final instances in this story where players' voices tangibly shaped company behavior, a rare moment where the relationship between consumer and corporation was genuinely reciprocal. By 2008, nearly everything had transitioned fully online. The end of inserts was part of a larger shift, arriving just as internet culture was becoming the dominant way players connected with companies and each other. Though strangely, the change came with a whimper, not a bang. Given how fiercely gamers often react to shifts in the status quo, especially as the internet centralized platforms and made complaints more visible, the quiet acceptance here was surprising. Why was it so silent? I believe there are three main reasons: the disappearance of game magazines and rewards programs, the ubiquity of collector's editions, and broader cultural shifts around digital interaction. The first change was structural. The outlets that once justified inserts were disappearing. PlayStation, the official magazine, shut down in 2012, right around the same time Nintendo Power ended, both casualties of the media industry's full embrace of digital. One of the last major reasons for inserts to still exist, magazine subscription offers, had disappeared. The same can be said about rewards programs, most notably Club Nintendo. When it closed down in 2016, replaced with the new and improved My Nintendo, which is fully online, the last inserts disappeared from Nintendo games. These changes certainly disappointed longtime fans, but they didn't spark that much outrage online. By then, so many similar shifts were happening across all industries that players had become numb to each new loss. The second was commercial. Publishers began rebranding free extras as premium goods, bundling them into an endless wave of collector's editions. By the late 2000s, these had become the only reliable way to get physical extras. Posters, art books, CDs, plushies, and all of the other free trinkets of the 80s and 90s had been migrated into premium editions. Enough time had passed since the days when these bonuses came standard that most consumers didn't even complain. And with every major publisher following the same distribution model, this became the new normal. The early social media discourse that may have taken place about the enshittification of physical games was instead focused on how fragmented collector's editions had become. I'm not implying that this was planned, but the timing did seem to work out for publishers. Assassin's Creed 3 is a perfect example. The Ubi Workshop edition came with a graphic novel and updated encyclopedia, while the limited edition included a statue but no encyclopedia. Assassin's Creed Unity is even worse. Look at this. Entire articles were written to help players keep track of which edition had which extras. Nearly every criticism video from this era focused on dunking on the sheer number of collector's editions, while almost none addressed the deeper issue, that customers had once free extras taken away and resold as part of paid bundles. The absurdity of it was obvious. The market was flooded with collector's editions, and the bonus items themselves had turned into a kind of collectathon, one driven less by excitement than by obligation. Players felt that they had to own every piece of their favorite game to feel complete. Wanting to participate in the full experience had been reframed as paying for fragments, yet the true injustice was rarely acknowledged in any meaningful way. The third reason was cultural. Digital platforms and online communities replaced the physical touchpoints that had once defined gaming. Now, they were mediated through logins and online storefronts. Anyone buying games had access to high-speed internet come 2010, so understanding that they were more likely to get their news through online sources or their interaction through social media on Facebook was a fair assumption to make. Digital distribution further accelerated the shift. Xbox Live Arcade, the PlayStation Store, and Steam turned games into downloads instead of boxes. Why bother with packaging at all when you could sell a game directly from a server? For publishers, it was the cheapest and most efficient option. And for players, it was becoming second nature. Physical game sales had been declining at an astounding rate since 2009. Steam made PC game boxes almost obsolete overnight. while Microsoft and Sony were pushing digital way more than physical in their advertising. Nintendo lagged behind this trend, not fully embracing it until around 2013 with the Wii U and 3DS eShop, but by then, the cultural shift was complete. What was lost barely registered as a concern, because no major publisher was doing anything differently. Inserts had once symbolized recognition and relationship. By the mid-2010s, loyalty was established, and most of it was mediated through digital ecosystems. Once players kept buying, regardless of changes to the product, the floodgates had opened. The real issue is that the usual safeguard mentioned for this sort of phenomenon, consumers quote-unquote voting with their wallets, never materialized. Instead of refusing the new model, people got really used to it. Collector's editions sold and digital downloads surged. The industry learned that the relationship could be hollowed out without consequence. Competition dwindled, and with it, the incentive to innovate. The shift from tactile interaction to silent digital transactions didn't happen by accident, nor did it happen overnight. It was the cumulative effect of structural changes, commercial rebranding, and cultural adaptation. Together, they reshaped the relationship between player and company into something one-sided, mediated, and transactional. By the time we reach the current generation of consoles, Switch, Xbox Series X, and PS5, physical games come with nothing. Even manuals made the jump to fully online around 2017. At this point, the physical purchase has lost nearly all of its cultural weight, existing as a formality in an industry that now expects players to live almost entirely online. Okay, this is kind of bleak, but it isn't where the story ends. In the modern day, inserts aren't only locked behind collector's editions. They've been kept alive by physical releases of indie games, which often include posters, postcards, stickers, all of that stuff we've talked about. Yes, these editions usually cost more than their digital counterparts, but that's to be expected. The reasoning is the important part. Maybe indie devs request this from their publishers out of nostalgia, recreating the kinds of experiences that inspired them in the first place. Maybe the publishers know that their smaller, more dedicated audiences value that sense of connection and find it profitable to separate themselves from their competition. Even if the motive isn't entirely altruistic, and I'm sure it isn't, the effect is real. Inserts remind players that someone on the other end thought about the experience of opening that box. Even if the mass market era of this is past, it's encouraging that some companies do see value in them. Because, as long as these connections keep being made, even in small ways, the idea of that relationship isn't gone. Who knows? Maybe I'll even get a response from Nintendo one day.
Dear valued customer, thank you for your continued support of our company. We are currently unable to assist with your inquiry. Please keep in mind that the real Nintendo Fun Club was the connection we built along the way.